мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Today at 1, we're live in Ukraine as Russia invades in a major military assault by land, sea and air.
It's now more than a month since the US Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan. China's ambassador to Australia also issued a blunt warning a few days ago that those who push for Taiwanese independence will be punished.
We're waiting for a peaceful reunification, but we cannot rule out other options.
You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed, it'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore.
Welcome to Why We Fight. Democracy is at war. Around the globe, we're watching the forces of authoritarianism rise. From regimes like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea to oligarchs, religious extremists, and populist demagogues. There are those who resist. Activists, journalists, academics, soldiers, faith leaders, and politicians. In this series, you'll meet them. You'll hear their stories, what they do, what democracy and freedom mean to them, and why it's worth fighting for. If you believe in this mission, don't forget to like and subscribe. Patreon and Substack supporters get early access and exclusive extras. And if you want to connect with others who care about democracy and a free, living world, join us on Discord. For my written work and commentary, check out my Substack, Dictators v. Democrats. With that said, let's go. Welcome to this episode of Why We Fight. Today we are in London, or at least I am in London, we're doing this remotely, talking to Mr. Jonathan Fink of the Silicon Curtain podcast. Jonathan, welcome. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
It's a delight. Thank you for inviting me on.
And for those in my audience who may not know, who are you and what do you do?
So I am the host of Silicon Curtain. Silicon Curtain is a YouTube channel and podcast which began, well, I had the idea for it back in 2016 when it seemed to me we were under attack from Russia, our institutions, and our electoral processes, and indeed our brains were being hacked already by sort of fairly sort of cunning Russian propaganda, and also, you know, activation of assets and proxies. But as is the way of things, I had the idea and then did nothing with it for quite a long time. And 2022, the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that was the trigger to start recording interviews. I'd never done anything like this before. I'm not a trained journalist. So I guess there was a certain amount of imposter syndrome, a kind of inertia that prevents you getting going. But the war was the trigger.
And what is your background, your professional background, and how did that assist you? Did that hinder you in any way?
Well, that's an interesting one. You know, if I get a part of this, which I don't go to too many these days, but if I do, and someone says, well, what do you do? I used to say, well, I do commercial propaganda. I do marketing. I hack people's brains to, you know, so they buy shit they don't need with money they don't have. That was my little party explanation. Now I can say that I'm making up for my sins by doing counter propaganda. Or pro-Ukraine propaganda. But no, I was a digital marketer. I was something called an SEO. So that's a search engine optimizer. That basically where you try to understand why, how, and when people buy stuff, what the patterns are, and then you try to reproduce that in a range of marketing materials. In my case, it was instructing teams of copywriters to embed these ideas, concepts, linguistic structures, particular phrases into content at scale, you know, large amounts of articles, FAQs, long form content. So it's a form of algorithmic hacking, and it's a form of brain hacking at the same time. In that sense, there's more commonality than you'd expect. You know, propaganda is nothing else if not a marketing technique combined with storytelling, combined with historical distortions, combined with geopolitics. It's an interesting kind of mixture there. But no, it's quite a good training, actually.
Would you say that there is a propaganda or marketing conflict between the autocracies and the democratic states?
No, we don't do we tend not to do black ops or reverse propaganda. Um, During the Cold War, I think we were rather effective at a form of propaganda, which was having, an overriding belief in our own values, which generally I think was pretty strong during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Um, a belief that our system was better than the Soviet system. And I think that was not that difficult to prove. When you see images of empty shops and you start talking about the suppression of dissidents and so on. But we had another aspect, which was soft cultural propaganda, which was the extraordinary flowering of music, culture, literature, and all these other phenomena of the 60s. I think that actually gave us almost a natural immunity in some ways to the worst aspects of communist propaganda that sought to try to divide and conquer, sought to spread nihilism and disbelief in our own values. Okay, there were some partial successes there, an infiltration of especially the extreme left in that period. They tended I think they started to sort of dabble a little bit with other extremist forces, but they tended not to gravitate towards the extreme right. Now, of course, we see Russian propaganda is willing to use whatever it takes to divide us. They'll use anything to try and drive a wedge in our societies and degrade our institutions and spread their own particular form of nihilism. And I'm afraid it's rather successful. It also taps in, I think, to a period of relative cynicism, postmodern cynicism, and disbelief in our own values, and a kind of self harming criticality when it comes to our history. That's not to say that we can't look at history, especially imperial history, with a critical eye. And I think it's very important for a healthy democracy that we do. But there seems to be a sort of self harming, self loathing aspect to it, which, of course, Russian propaganda is only too willing to exacerbate. But we don't really go the other way. We don't point out beyond just sort of factual media the iniquities and the brutality of Russian society and its system. And goodness knows, the last 3 years, we've had plenty of material that we could have used if we were going to try to undermine the Russian regime. I just don't think we have a sense they're at war. We don't have a sense that we're under attack and actually that there is some existential risk to our values. And therefore, we're not doing offensive information operations against our adversaries. And that's a shame, because it means we are weaker and they are stronger as a result.
What role do you think you are playing in this information conflict? Do you think it's defensive in terms of debunking sort of Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, or as you've just said, are you trying to take a more offensive role and reach out to individuals on the other side of the Silicon Curtain?
It's offensive. I think I can answer that very, very clearly. Quite early on in trying to teach myself about sort of propaganda, I came to the realization that fact checking plays an important role within the ecosystem, but it's more important on the professional side, which would be analysts, journalists, politicians, and so on. Even then, it's only partially successful. But debunking does not have, I think, a very, it's not a very effective tool to counter the kind of propaganda that we are seeing, the extraordinary effectiveness, not just propaganda, but also various entities that we harbor in our own societies as well. Whether they're agents or assets of the Russian state, or whether it's simply sort of grifters going with the flow, we have a lot of highly corrosive informational sources in our own societies. Tucker Carlson is a classic example. I would almost say that GB News is also one of those corrosive influences in the UK. But we could list over and over and over again various media that distorts and manipulates because of its commercial model and the way it uses political biases and partisan biases and even made up crap to power its commercial model. So yeah, we harbor some of the tools of our own destruction. Now, what I'm doing here is quite specifically offensive, and it is quite specific that I'm trying to counter Russian disinformation. You could call it pre-bunking. You could call it more offensive information operations. But I am specifically trying to energize people, not just to consume information or feel disheartened or, yes, we got the correct information, but oh my God, what do we do with it? No, the point is that you take this information and you're in action and you react to it by doing something. And I think that is the message that I'm trying to sort of put across here. The channel has a purpose. The purpose, now I'm not going to say I'm going to achieve that single-handedly because that would be fairly delusional. The purpose is to bring about the elimination, destruction, or collapse of the last great land-based empire in history, and one of the most brutal, one of the most corrosive and divisive and parasitic and evil entities, and that is Russian imperialism that was transmuted through from Tsarism to the USSR and has now perhaps transformed into its most toxic format, which is Putinist fascism. My purpose is very, very clear. Do everything I can to bring about its destruction and elimination from world history and all the evils that are attendant with it.
With the end of Putinist fascism, take this hypothetical, Russia still exists. Well, the Russian landmass still exists. The Russian people will still exist, will still be there. What sort of Russia in future do you... What would a non-imperialist Russia look like in your eyes?
This is the key question. I don't think there is a definitive answer to that. One almost might say it's not up to us to impose that idea on Russia, but I think it is worth exploring some of the possibilities and assessing them as to how probable they are, how realistic they are, how desirable they are. Now, both analysts and politicians in the West have assiduously avoided not just having any of these conversations, but even getting into speculation about this. It seems that Western foreign policy, really from the point where the USSR started to collapse, was to try to hold Russia together while failing to recognize that it was still an imperial entity, still a landmass that comprised many dozens, if not many hundreds, of ethnicities, nationalities, diverse cultures. These have been comprehensively repressed, of course, by the USSR, by the Soviet Union, and by Tsarism before it. But the Soviet Union was just was a great evil there. It suppressed and eliminated a huge range of ethnic cultures, and I would say took the energy out of many of them. So, but I think this is a worthwhile conversation to happen because there's things we can do to accelerate the decline of the Russian Empire as a concept. There may be nothing we can do to prevent it. Therefore, this conversation, I think, is also important in trying to map out what potential futures there are. But for instance, one of the big conversations has been around ethnicities, that you could have dozens of newly emergent countries from the landmass of Russia. Now, maybe Chechnya, maybe there's a couple of other instances where you have an ethnic majority, as it were, with relatively few ethnic Russians in a region like Chechnya that has at least some suppressed flowering of national identity. As we know, there were two Chechen wars, and now warlords suppress that emergence of a sort of ethnic national identity that is distinct from Russia as a political entity. But I think on the rest of the territory, we have to be a little more imaginative, because other ethnicities aren't necessarily the majority in all territories, and there's very large numbers of ethnic Russian populations. So if the imperial concept is going to have to come to an end, and I think for peace and security in Europe it must, then there needs to be maybe a more complex understanding of multi-layered identities. People can be Russian but not Imperial Russian. They can be Northern Russian. They can be from the sort of Leningrad Oblast, and create distinct regional identities in areas where you have a mixture of ethnic Russians and other ethnicities. You'd have to have something more complex, where a sense of local identity, whether it's the region, the town, or emergent local cultures, that would have to have a greater primacy than people defining themselves as just purely Russian and associating that with a sort of imperial construct very much based on Moscow. So these are very difficult things, and it's very difficult to see how the Russia will transition to that basis. But I think it's worth contemplating what would need to happen in order for that imperial aggression to subside, and for there to be an emergent, perhaps democratic culture. And this is the other key thing, I think, which is this is the problem with sort of Western policy as a whole, and the failure of imagination. We think that Russia needs to be stable, otherwise what you'll get is chaos, etc. And yet at the same time, we hold the hope that it will become a democratic entity and there'll be a flowering of democratic, tolerant culture. The way it exists, where 90% of the wealth of the country ends up in Moscow and is consumed by a tiny parasitic elite, and we can see in the last couple of years that elite foments all sorts of crises and wars in order to maintain its hold, not just on power, but on access to the resources of the country. The two things are very much tied together. The primacy of Moscow, the primacy of the kleptocratic elite, and the concept of empire, because most of the resources do not reside in Moscow. They reside in all the places where there are other ethnicities. If you don't solve all of these problems somehow, then you will not get an emergent democracy, and you will continue to get the instability, the wars, the chaos, the aggression. It's almost, I would say, baked in or hardwired into the kind of vertical system based on Moscow that you've got. For there to be any kind of emergent, organic democratic processes, I think they have to be local and they have to come from the bottom up. They will always be stifled, eradicated, exterminated, as long as you have a parasitic kleptocratic elite running the show from Moscow and controlling all the means of communication, which all goes to reinforce this imperial construct and mindset.
Professor Galeotti, the Kremlin watcher of some regard, has spoken out repeatedly about our failure to engage with the exiled diaspora, and that we should be attempting to build a Russian civil society in exile. What would you say to him? Are you in agreement, or is this where you may diverge?
I diverge almost entirely, because there are figures such as Kasparov who do have significant engagement with the West. And Kasparov and even Khodorkovsky are two, perhaps, of, I would say, the most experimental thinkers when it comes to what a future Russia could be like and contemplating a post-imperial Russia. And they do get considerable engagement with foreign politicians and analysts, especially Kasparov. Khodorkovsky, I mean, would probably complain that their fairly cynical interpretation of Russia is really not internalized or properly listened to by Western analysts, Western policymakers, certainly. I think that's more of the failure of leadership within our political systems, but that's another question. And then you have various people in the diaspora, many of whom are in sort of Poland and I think Latvia, and some in Lithuania. And they're running quite successful information operations that are targeted back on ethnic Russians. So we've created an environment where the Russian diaspora can broadcast and do their activism. Some, like Karamurza, are almost incessantly invited on media programs and into parliaments and so on. So I'm afraid it's a little bit of a whinge. It's a little bit of an empty whinge to say, they're ignored or marginalized. But there is another problem here as well. They don't cooperate amongst each other. None of them do. None of them cooperate, really. I mean, there's a few who, they might overlap in a kind of loose Venn diagram kind of way. But people like Navalny team, I have to say, from what I could tell, are pretty exclusive. They want their way or the highway. They do not want to cooperate with others, and others do not want to cooperate with them. The idea of having a democratic dialogue, the idea of having an open and robust debate where you can't win every argument, seems to be alien. It's going to sound harsh, but it seems to be alien to much of the Russian diaspora. They do not have a democratic culture in that sense. And even Navalny, for all of his suffering and martyrdom, and the fact he was absolutely brilliant at manipulating information. I mean, he was an extraordinary communicator, but made quite a few tactical mistakes, and Ukrainians will point that out with alacrity, and some of his points of view that are highly questionable. The same can be said for someone like Karamurza. We almost lionize. We almost turn Russian opposition into saints and martyrs. We want them to fit a certain narrative, and many of them are actually quite happy to go along with that, because if you fit into those narrative patterns, you get more coverage, and you fit into the sort of saints and martyrs sort of playbook that the media seeks to want to impose. Ukrainians tend not to want to do that. They don't want to be perfect victims. They don't want to be this or that. And Ukraine doesn't get nearly so much attention, actually, as some of the key Russian dissidents do. In reality, who is really challenging Putin's regime? Who is making real action to oppose the genocidal authoritarianism of the Putin regime? Ukraine. It's only Ukraine, and it's only Ukrainians who are standing up and dying and fighting back against it. For all of the opposition's noise and fury that they're creating, all of the media product that they're pumping out on all of the interviews, has anything changed? Has there been a single campaign of protest, mass organized campaign of protest within Russia that has challenged the regime? Has there been a general strike? Has there been anything like the sort of White Rose campaign in Germany, fascist Germany, where people on a large scale leave sort of anti-regime messages? Is there anything like what one would expect in terms of civic disobedience, protestations, etc.? No, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. And Russians will say, well, you can't protest, a regime like this because it's so vicious, it's so brutal, it's so this, it's so that. But the trouble with Russian opposition is for the positive stories that are there, and for the few artists and people who have gone to prison, it's nowhere near the threshold amount that would be required to represent any kind of challenge to the regime whatsoever. And that is a failure of opposition in Russia. That is a failure of civic society. And unfortunately, it's way, way, way beneath the threshold of something like Maidan in Ukraine. It's way, way, way below the threshold of the brave protests in Belarus, which unfortunately failed. It's just not on the same scale, and therefore it's not going to succeed. So we tend to turn the few cases who heroically resist the regime into saints and martyrs, and including some of the Russian opposition who I find extraordinarily divisive and some of the things they do is hugely detrimental to their own cause, and yet we still put them on a pedestal and have unrealistic expectations of what they can achieve and what their motivations in some cases are. We had. We've got one oppositionist called Yulia Latinina, who continues to have very high profile media presence in the Russian diaspora, and she says the most awful pro-imperial weird kind of stuff. You have Karamurza, who says some good stuff, and he says some absolutely dire, appalling, dreadful stuff, which is never called out, never properly called out by the media, and yet he's given endless platform to sort of spew this stuff. Yulia Navalny herself, one has to ask what she's actually achieved, and has she ever once talked about a Ukrainian victory being the most effective way to oppose Putin's totalitarianism? No, she's come out and said quite the opposite. She said, well, she can't really support anything that would kill Russians because what? They're her future voters, as she sees it. So no, the Russian opposition is a problem. There are some extraordinary people out there doing some great informational work, but I would say it's less the work of activists; it's more the work of broadcasting good information. Like Michael Naki and a few others are doing a tremendous job at trying to bring truth to the Russian community. But this is an interesting question. I'll bounce back to you. Truth does not necessarily translate into political action.
Well, there's another question I'm going to ask later about the difference between truth and narrative. But for my audience who may not know, can you perhaps provide some examples of things these opposition leaders have said which are negative, which are harming the Russian cause?
Yeah. Well, Yulia Navalny, for instance, Navalny supposedly messages he smuggled out of prison. Ukrainians tend to focus on some of his previous statements, which were not so good. For instance, when asked, this is quite a long time ago, when asked what should happen to Crimea, he said, well, what's happened, and it's not a sandwich. You don't hand it backwards and forwards. Well, of course, Ukrainians are extraordinarily as one could expect, miffed at that. And in fact, I think he later came to realize that if you don't support the rule of law, that comes back to bite you. And indeed, many Russians who might have celebrated the taking of Crimea or not thought it was a big issue, some of them have now come to realize that that was the pivotal point, that if you allow rule of law and international law to slide, then anything's possible, and you end up with where we ended up. Navalny's later statements rode that back. And he said, no, Ukraine needs to be, there needs to be a process whereby Crimea is given back to Ukraine and put under its jurisdiction. And some of his later statements are quite interesting in that respect. Navalny, however, the wife, Yulia, has never once come out and said that a Ukrainian victory. She barely even mentions Ukraine ever in any of her speeches. Whenever the idea of victimhood comes up, and it comes up an awful lot in the narratives of many Russian oppositionists, the victimhood is always about Russian victimhood and Russian political prisoners and etc. and the diaspora. Ukrainians are victims and very rarely mentioned, and very rarely mentioned with the sort of empathy that it requires. And this is a problem because I think Russians they lack a certain mechanic of empathy because it's been driven out, or its development has been certainly disrupted by the terrible events of, say, the revolution and the subsequent repressions over many, many decades. So there is a problem with political and human empathy there, which makes it difficult for opposition to really grow. I mean, Karamurza does talk a lot about, Ukraine and the suffering inflicted by Putin. And he says some things which are very positive. He says other things which boggle the mind. For instance, he still talks about sanctions needing to be lifted because they're hurting ordinary Russians. Well, the logic of lifting sanctions against the current regime is that it has more capability to kill Ukrainians. So that already is an extraordinary, illogical, and irrational position. And one can only wonder why he has that position. He recently spoke to the French Parliament, or the French Senate. Unfortunately, he's one of these Russian intelligence who speaks fluent French as well as English, and so he's able to address directly. And that's why perhaps he didn't get a huge amount of coverage in the English language. But he basically said to the French Senate that it's not ethnic Russians committing the crimes, or if they are, they're compelled to do that. It's all the minorities who are, they're very, very damaged, very sick people. It's the minorities who are committing the crimes. And the reason he gave, he said, is that if Russians are committing the crimes, then it's because it's under compulsion, because Russia and Ukraine are one and the same. We're the same people. So we couldn't in all conscience do that to our brothers and sisters. Well, it flies in the face of all the evidence. And then if one takes a step back, and this is why I rail against Russian imperialism, because it infects many of the so-called democratic opposition, democratic imperialists or liberal imperialists, as Ukrainians refer to them as, who enslaved and brutalized Russia's ethnic minorities, who keeps them in abject poverty and denies education so that the rape of their territories can continue, of their resources, of gold and aluminium and oil and gas. It's ethnic Russians. Who sent them to kill and die? Ethnic Russians. Who presses the buttons on the missiles that are sent remotely to kill Ukrainians? Who pilots the drones? In not so many instances is it going to be the less well-educated ethnic minorities or people from the provinces. It's going to be the more ethnic Russian elite who are pulling all the strings. So him saying these things, it's grotesque. It's absolutely grotesque. And it's an extraordinary insult to Ukrainians who are the victims of this. But I've spoken to many, many Russians who have some sympathy for Ukraine, but almost instinctively will put their own suffering, their own victimhood ahead of anyone and anything else. I had a friend who came up with an extraordinary phrase near the start of the invasion. Now, this person had been on protest. This person had been arrested and put in the so-called CISOR several times and risked beatings and rape. That didn't thankfully happen to them, but taken great personal risk. But then sent me a communication where they said, well, of course, this war is terrible for Ukrainians, but it's worse for us.
I mean, we've both been in Ukraine, and it's rather different when you can feel the shockwaves of the missiles and drones landing, which I don't think you can often feel in Moscow.
No, you can feel the terror of if you did speak out, someone would come to your door. But then many of those people sort of fled the country and do very little in exile to support Ukraine or fight their own regime. So I found that an extraordinary statement. In some respects, I mean, if you're going to be very charitable, you could say, well, maybe it is worse for Russians because Ukrainians are actively resisting. Ukrainians are being themselves while undergoing these physical traumas. It's better for them because they are still Ukraine and they're not under an authoritarian regime. I'm not sure that's what that person meant. I think it's an imperial idea where Russians need to be the best at something if they're going to participate. But if we're talking about the Olympics of suffering, they also need to have the primacy of victimhood. It's a very imperial mentality to put yourself first in every single situation and consume the oxygen. I mean, this is what a lot of other Russian oppositionists are doing. One thinks of, Navalny's book and the film and the Oscar ceremony. Okay, these are all interesting and useful oppositional products. But there are so many instances where Ukrainians are asked to share a stage with Russians. And organizers wonder why they don't want to do that, because Ukrainians know more often than not what's going to happen. Either it's going to be with a sympathetic Russian, but they'll win the struggle of who can be the greater victim, or they may be put on stage with someone who turns out to be a liberal imperialist who will show little to no empathy for the Ukrainian position, but will seek to take up all the oxygen in whatever space or environment they've been placed in. This is why I don't think it's time for Russian culture. I'm not into banning culture, but now is not the time to give it primacy or give it focus. Now is the time to rectify a historical wrong, and that is to understand and give primacy to Ukrainian voices, because we have to correct for centuries of imperialism that has smothered their voices and is seeking to do that now militarily, and has actively genocided the creative individuals and destroyed their creative works and tried to prevent the environment where those works could flourish. We have to correct that. So when people talk about, great Russian culture, and then try to have this conversation with a great friend of mine just recently, and they compared it to, but the British suppressed, Ireland and Irish voices, etc. I said, well, look, yes, you can make that case, and it's absolutely true that British imperialism was not a picnic, especially when it comes to Ireland, to put it mildly. But I said, in all these things, you're repeating a propagandistic narrative if you don't put nuance, if you don't have a sense of scale. And I said, did the British ever go to Dublin and gather every single creative talent they could find, let's say in the 1920s? Did we take every single writer and every single artist and every single performer and every single musician, and did we take them out to a valley just outside Dublin and shoot them all? And then did we pretend that Irish culture was English and that it actually never existed and that it's not a thing? And did we totally take it over and label Irish culture as British? We didn't go to that extent. We might have seen Irish culture as secondary. We might have seen it as inferior. We might have persecuted. We did not commit mass genocide in the 20th century of any culture that could threaten the primacy of our own culture. We have to have a sense of proportion when we talk about Russia.
I agree, although I think we should be careful about whataboutism from both angles.
And that's not,
and we should,
this isn't whataboutism. This is, I would call it almost a sort of finding an appropriate relative comparison, saying, yes, this was terrible, and really calling out the detail. But I think when you make a false equivalence between two things, you do a disservice to both of them. And this is one of those instances.
I agree.
Yeah.
And I also think it's key to point out when talking, or at least when talking about Russian imperialism today, and when faced with this challenge about the imperialism of the past, that Britain and France, to a certain extent, both countries have faced an imperial reckoning, and a recognition that imperialism is an evil, whereas Russia, as we have discussed at length, has not. And imperialism still runs deeply through Russian culture.
But I'm taking a good example of that, which is some of the most vibrant literature in the English language, very much so supported and fostered by British institutions, and things like the Booker Prize and so on, have been post-colonial voices. So I don't think we should take credit for that. Their voices are their own, and their power of communication is their own, their culture is their own. But we have sought to enable those, and we've embraced those as a culture. Russia still seeks to stifle and eradicate any other voice that isn't the pure imperial ethnicity. And if they are going to allow any other ethnicities to have culture and language, it can only be in the format of a second tier. It cannot be seen as having primacy with the imperial culture. So Russia is still stuck in that mindset. That's why I think, making a relative comparison does an incredible disservice to reality and to the ongoing mechanics of that imperialism, which Russia is adhering to.
This is something that Sheikh Said Ismagilov, one of Ukraine's most senior Islamic clerics, talks about at length. A lot of what he does is Russian language, YouTube commentary, etc., aimed at the Islamic community in Russia, who are, in his words, seen as second or third class citizens, depending on their ethnicity. But I want to bring it back to the dissidents and to our the Western treatment, perhaps is the wrong word, but how we interact with them. There are problems. You've pointed that out at length. But what should we be doing that we're failing to do at the moment? How should we be interacting with them? Because they have significant potential pull in any future Russia, and if they're going down the wrong path again, well, that's going to be a problem in years to come. So should we perhaps be supporting them while trying to take them on a different path?
I don't think either of those are, I mean, to contemplate that, we have to say, what are we failing to do and what could we be doing different? I think we're not necessarily failing in that sense. I think many of these oppositionists are given sort of platforms. But all I can say in this instance is what my direct experience is and what I've tried to do. I've tried to get every leading Russian oppositionist onto my channel. And I've tried every method to contact, communicate, and go through intermediaries. Garry Kasparov has been on. Ilya Ponomarov has been on many times, and he's actually in Ukraine, doing real stuff, working with people who are, fighting in the Free Russian battalions. So he's been on many times. We've had a very interesting character called Alexander Nevzovorov, a former, one could call him a journalist, but he's also a former propagandist. He's come on the channel. He's an extraordinary character. He's quite divisive. For some, he was, by his own admission, one of these ethnic Russian imperialists, but always a sort of complex, mercurial figure. He's come on the channel. He saw an opportunity, but he's not an active. He's not a political activist. He's not seeking to return to Russia and attain high office. Ponomarov is. Kasparov probably isn't seeking to take office. He's just opposing. Out of all those who really seek to become involved in mainstream politics upon their return to Russia, do you know what percentage of people that I reached out to even responded, let alone agreed to come on the channel?
I couldn't guess.
0%. Zero. None of them. None. That doesn't happen in any other demographic I've reached out to. I mean, Western politicians aren't particularly great at responding or giving their time. We talked about that before we hit record. But I have had a few on, and there are techniques there about building your network up and trying to create the sense of an opportunity with them. It's they're far less responsive than say historians, far less responsive than analysts, far less responsive than Ukrainian politicians, far less responsive than any kind of academics and analysts who are generally respond positively to requests to come on. Politicians are really difficult to get on. Really difficult, I think, for them to see the opportunities in doing this outside of their own self-interest or the self-interest of their group or clan or tribe. And I think a lot of politicians tend to be more managerial in their thinking, so they find it difficult. They'll go on traditional sort of media stuff, but they find it difficult to imagine formats outside of that. But the Russian opposition is in another order, is another scale. To have out of many, many, many dozens of approaches to individuals and having reached out multiple times to those individuals and got nothing back is, to my mind, an extraordinary. It also tells me they're not interested in what we think. They're not interested in our support. They couldn't care less. They want to go back to Russia and they only want to speak to a Russian-minded audience. They don't want to talk about this sort of post-colonial stuff. They don't really want to talk about Ukraine because they want to get voted back in Russia, where the mindset of the majority of the population is still stuck in this imperial dynamic. So unfortunately, I'd like to be optimistic about this, but my direct experience tells me to be incredibly cynical when it comes to the Russian opposition, because they do not act like a democratic opposition. They do not act as people who have a sense, I would say, of a broader societal values. That's my pure cynicism there. Although there are some individuals I say respect, and there are some who've come on the channel, but none of them are what you would call political activists.
Okay, well, you touched on it briefly there, and you touched on it before, but the Russians within Russia, the voter base of a potential future, we're not talking to them very much. There are actors that do, of course, but I'm wondering, do you have any audience within Russia? Do you have any feedback from them? And do you see signs of hope or disillusionment within Russia from the people who do listen to you? And further to that, what should our governments and the activists, journalists, etc., be doing to potentially reach that audience? Because it seems to me, and Ukrainians tell me this constantly, the problem is not Putin. The problem is Russian imperialism is a part of Russian culture and society.
Yes. There is, and I don't have an answer to this because I do not think we have the resources or capability to reach these people. We just do not. And the Russian system invests hundreds of millions of dollars a year in the informational system they've constructed, and it's rather effective. We do not have the resources or the skill or understanding to cut through. So I don't think a sort of more traditional media campaign fits. And when you have so many, you have quite a few Russians, such as people like Michael Naki, Vladimir Milov, and others who are broadcasting to a Russian audience, and they're providing pretty good information to them, actually. There's another one called Plushev, who's pretty good. They're providing decent, factually based information with critical analysis, and some of it includes critical comments on Russian imperialism, and they're getting millions of views a week. We cannot compete with that, and we do not understand the mindset. What I find is interesting is that around just under sort of 0.5% of my audience is Ukraine based. And that might not sound like a lot, but actually it's quite extraordinary, because Ukrainians, I'm not going to say they're like Russians, but there's a similar thing here. If they watch a news source or some kind of commentator, and that commentator maybe is, 80%, 70%, 90% correct, all it takes is a couple of phrases or bits of analysis that jar with their sense of lived reality or jar with their understanding of historical context. That source becomes dead to them. So not that many Ukrainians, I think, especially if they're based in Ukraine, will actually listen to most Western analysis that we're listening to, simply because the accuracy in their minds of it is very far from optimal, and it will just jar far too often. There would be a similar problem in trying to reach a Russian audience. We don't have the cultural context. We don't have the references and the lived experience. And we might be giving them good information, but it would just overall would jar. And actually, there are relatively few analysts who can give that kind of information that would be more useful, I think, than some of the Russian diaspora. So that I wouldn't advocate going down that route. It's too expensive and it's doomed to fail. What we could be doing is black propaganda. And in this instance, I'm thinking of satire in particular. And this is something Peter Pomerantsev has talked about. He talked about how we were quite effective, actually, at doing black propaganda ops in wartime in World War II. Now, whether that shifted the course of the war is highly debatable, but it was an important set of techniques. Sefton Delmer and others that implemented it, but we didn't directly script it. We used Germans who who'd fled the Nazi regime, and many who'd been part of the very vivid cultural and sort of burlesque type scene of the 1920s and 30s. We used them to create incredibly vicious sort of satire and sort of various pop culture, which we broadcasted back into Germany, along with some key intelligence and distorted narratives to try and undermine the German war effort. That also focused on local political scandals and individuals and commanders who were on the make or who were vicious. And, so you had to have a minute understanding of local politics to really drill in. We should be producing these kind of propagandistic units, employing ethnic Russians, satirists, dramatists, actors, etc., and we should be injecting highly corrosive materials back into Russia. There's TikTok, there's YouTube, there's all this kind of stuff. Now, these platforms are banned in Russia or blocked, but with a VPN, you can access them. And of course, little shorts or little TikToks of satire about the Putin regime could be highly effective. We know that Putin, one of his first actions when he became president was to take over the NTV network run by Gusinski. The story is it's because he wanted to shut down objective news sources. Now, he was far more worried about the satirical programs it was running, including the Russian version of Spitting Image, which was called Kukly, because it devastated his image. Like the early episodes when he became prime minister, they were depicting him as some evil gnome from Tales of Hoffman. They destroyed his credibility. He had to take them off the air.
That really gels in, and that's, I guess, what I've been getting towards is this is a back and forth information conflict. Psychological manipulation is used by autocratic regimes, but and we need to defend against it. And if you are constantly on the defensive, you are fighting a losing war. Yeah. But how else do you think democracies can build societal resilience against the kind of influence that we're seeing from Russia, and that I've been asking about how we can counter?
We have to work on our own democracy as well. I don't think it's enough to spin a story if it's at variance with reality. We have to work hard on our own democracies and our own institutions. We have to work hard on creating more equitable societies with more equitable and efficient distribution of resources. And we have to do a lot of hard thinking about democracy and relearn, as Ukrainians keep telling me, that freedom isn't free and democracy comes at a price. I think these are two concepts that we've forgotten. One of my videos going live tonight is with the Nobel laureate Alexander Matviechuk, and she makes a point that for most in the West, democracy has come down to whether you choose one cheese or another at the supermarket aisle. And the availability and the price of those objects. Democracy isn't about that. These are manifestations of democracy in a well-run society. But I think we've lost sight of the pain and struggle that's involved in constantly sort of renewing freedom. And of course, now we have instruments of mass creation of information, but rather than enhancing insight, rather than enhancing knowledge, it seems that we're drowning in information and losing sight, losing the wood from the trees, as it were. We have to work hard to recover that. And I think that's what Ukrainians are doing. Yes, we focus on their suffering for freedom. There's less focus on also how much sacrifice Ukrainians have been making in the struggle to create to move out from a kleptocratic authoritarian past and move into a far more sort of equitable, innovative, productive and comfortable future. they're not just fighting at the front. The fight is happening in so many ways, and I think people need to acquaint themselves with Maidan. I think this is the other challenge you have with the Russian opposition. Many of them will see Maidan as something that is purely Ukrainian, that it's a method that worked for Ukraine, but they don't see it as a positive. In some ways, they've imbibed not just regime propaganda, but also the very idea of revolution is almost an anathema to many Russians. They look at the chaos that it unleashed as being something terrifying, rather than actually a natural process, an essential process in the creation and then renewal of democracy. These sort of tectonic shifts or, releases of pressure. What you want is lots of little earthquakes rather than one big earthquake, which is the Russian Revolution. Unfortunately, generally the Russian mindset fits with the idea that security should be prioritized over freedom, and strong rulers over what they see as democratic weakness. So Russia is almost condemned to having, one giant San Andreas fault style reset every 100 years, rather than, multiple little mini earthquakes, which Ukraine's been going through, which turns out to be an essential mechanism for democratic renewal. Well, we also seem to have forgotten that we need mini revolutions almost on a constant basis in order to switch things up. Stability is not necessarily stable.
How do we get that sense of value for democracy back in a comfortable West?
It's the onus is on individuals to participate in discourse, to participate in politics. This cannot be top down. There has to be a threshold number of people from the bottom up who get stuck in. I think that's the answer to it. Whether that's going to happen or not, because I think you can immediately see all sorts of problems with that. But it seems to me that's the only way to do it, is to get a threshold number of people who are really engaged in politics and may not like the parties we've got, but get stuck in nonetheless. So the passive consumption of information is not going to get us there. And this is one of the big, I think, learnings I've had the last couple of years, is that the Russian diaspora may have access to good information. Some of them may consume it and they may know what's going on. But that does not result in political action, political organization, or political change. I think that's a lesson we also perhaps need to learn. In our sense, we prioritize entertainment over knowledge, and we prioritize information over action as well in our systems. We don't have exactly the same problem that Russia has, but if we carry on down this path, then we're going to start seeing similar kind of issues.
And as a disinformation expert, I wanted to ask, and I'm sure you've been asked this question many times and given a lot of thought, social media and the way social media companies run their platforms seems to me one of the greatest challenges that modern democracy faces in the strength of information and the power of disinformation. It seems to spread a lot faster. In fact, it does spread a lot faster. What should policymakers be doing, and what should society be doing to reverse this negative trend?
So I can't give an answer that's better than the one that Yuval Noah Harari gave in a recent lecture, and he makes an interesting point. This is not a new problem. We've had print media now for a couple of centuries, certainly in the UK, and frameworks and expertise has been built up so that, yes, you'll have various manipulation and prioritization within editorial processes, but there's been an understanding that if you put lies, outright lies, knowingly on the front page of a newspaper and dominate the headline simply because the lie gets more response, you're going to be in a terrible place very, very quickly. So a culture has built up where you don't actually do that. Yes, newspapers will try to gain people's attention, but you don't put the worst clickbait rubbish on the front page. And in the first, 1, 2, 3 pages of the newspaper, you have certain frameworks for dealing with information, editorial processes. So tech companies that say they don't produce the content and it's not their fault are demonstrating either extraordinary naivety or a grotesque level of self-interested hypocrisy, because it's the algorithm. They've given agency to the algorithm, and they've defined the algorithm to basically put in front of people to create primacy of the worst subject matter, to hack human brains and look for all of the weaknesses and fallibilities and seek to make money out of manipulating those. So the social media companies are not responsible for the content that's created, but they are responsible for the algorithms that give primacy to lies. And they should be held accountable for that. And to say that this is a new problem and, oh dear, but it's infringement of freedom, or how can we do this? Well, I think we need to legislate the algorithms. We absolutely do. We need to make them accountable for those algorithms, not necessarily for the content that is placed on the platforms, but they ought to have some kind of responsibility for tagging or flagging content if it is demonstrably untrue. So by giving primacy to lies and giving no context to what they publish, the technologists are absolutely culpable for the mess that they're helping to create.
Well, I mean, we saw Elon Musk's father in St. Petersburg recently. I wonder how much of that is intentional mess. Musk is not a pro-democracy figure.
He's not. There is an interesting thing, though, and this is going to insult all the engineers who are listening in. I
apologize to my engineering audience. I do have some. I know I have some. They may all be in Glasgow, but
I worked in Silicon Valley for a while, and this is the early stages of the sort of the web boom, as it were. I think just prior to Web 2.0, which followed the big crash that happened, and of course it's extraordinary. The achievements are extraordinary of the technical elite, and many of them are programmers and engineers. I mean, Silicon Valley is stuffed with them, and many of the key entrepreneurs come from engineering backgrounds. And this isn't an assault to engineers, but engineers tend to face problems, or every problem as if it's an engineering problem, as if you can create a technical solution that could be worked out from a blueprint to solve the problem, like building a bridge or building a social network or whatever it happens to do. These are engineering-led solutions to problems. All these mobile taxi services and so on. You can use, algorithms and systems and networks to solve all these problems. And it seemed to me, even back then in the early 2000s, when I had conversations, that when it came to politics and history, there's an extraordinary naivety, because what many of these people, the way they think is in terms of engineering solutions to every problem. They don't think in terms of ambiguity or nuance or circumstances where multiple things may be partially true at the same time. So yes, we could say, Musk behaves like a Russian asset. We can also say that both the best and the worst of Silicon Valley come at the world, and especially the world of geopolitics, with an extraordinary naivety, an extraordinary lack of an understanding of how historical processes unfold and how human psychology, as expressed through historical processes and political processes, manifests. They don't understand it, and they come at it from the point of view of trying to find structural solutions to complex, messy problems. It's a little bit like asking physicists to solve biological problems. Not not the best way of understanding how things work. The trouble is, we live in a world where these technocrats are seeking to gain a lot of political influence, and yet their understanding of history and psychology is woefully insufficient to the task. And yeah, some of them, some of them also, in that sense, will not really understand the mechanics, the irrationality of Russian imperialism, and the mechanics of it that hark back to a pre-industrial age. They may align with Russia simply because they don't get or understand what they're dealing with, because it's irrational. It's not economically rational. It's not a post-industrial, post-Renaissance Enlightenment shaped way of thinking. It's comes from a seriously dark age of history, a pre-industrial win lose zero sum kind of mentality. Almost, I would say, almost pre-agricultural. The way the mechanic of Russian imperialism operates is almost like slash and burn. It destroys as it expands, rather than building and cultivating. I don't think any of them really understand that. Many of our politicians don't understand that either.
You focus on Russia, which, given the current state of things, is entirely reasonable. I wonder, and I think though that you're incorrect in one assertion that you made earlier, that Russia is the last great land empire. I think there's another further to the south and east.
China is also an entity in that sense. Yes.
Do you worry that the fall of Russia, which you seek, will lead to the rise of a greater, more powerful China?
I think that's almost inevitable anyway, given their industrial capacity and might. But I also think there's distinct differences there. I don't think China rather has the inexorable need to expand. And indeed, the way it's extended its power over the early 20th century is through, I would say, economic imperialism, as opposed to directly needing to conquer and erase new territories. Yes, it has claim to lands which it sees as historically Chinese, and there are many ethnicities which it lays claim to or controls. Which is spurious and dubious, to put it mildly. And there's big chunks of Russian territory which they technically may have a right to, which the Russian Empire stole off them in the late 19th century and early 20th century. But I don't see this inexorable expansion of China territorially as being the mechanic there. I think they are a very agricultural society. In that sense, civilizationally, they're a step beyond Russia. They're not a nation of well, Russia would describe itself as a nation of warriors. I just think they're not very good at it though. So they're a nation of people who like to fight. That's how I put it into Russia. It's a militaristic empire, whereas China is largely has its basis as an agrarian empire. So there's already a slightly different kind of mindset to the mechanics of how it's organized.
We do see
good industry. I mean, they are very good at cooperating and organizing to produce extraordinary manufacturing capability. We do not see that coming out of Russia. In that sense, it's an empire, but it has a different mechanic to Russian imperialism.
It does, but perhaps this is something we can get onto in another. I think this is going to go down another episode, perhaps. But Chinese aggression and expansionism is something that we have seen over the last century, and we certainly see coming up. The joke among the journalists in the bars of Kyiv is, when this is over, I'll see you on the beaches of Taiwan. Yes. And of course, we have the genocidal oppression of the Uyghurs and the erasure of Tibetan culture. But I think we could go on and on. on this.
That's definitely another episode, I think,
Yes, I think
with
so.
China. And just to top out, why do I focus on Russia? I think one, Russia is a lens through which many of these issues can be analyzed, including imperialism, the rise of a new wave of technology and conflict, dictatorship at its very worst manifestation, informational hybrid warfare. I mean, Russia is a lens through which so many of these things can be examined, including our own democratic sliding that we're seeing and vulnerability of our institutions. But it also is the fact that I speak Russian and I spent time there. And I think it's important to have that direct connection to be able to understand sources in the original language. The challenge I have with China is my knowledge of its history is minimal compared to that of Russia and the region, and I can't speak either Cantonese or Mandarin, so I'm at a significant disadvantage there. And I think, if anything, running the channel has shown me that I need to stick to what I know. I need to be able to explore that and constantly, revise it and challenge it, but understanding the language gives me a grounding which I don't have in any other area of the world, including the Middle East and in China. So yes, we cover it, but I just feel it's so easy to slip into narratives. It's so easy to slip into cliches. I want to be able to properly examine my assumptions, and it helps to know Russian to do that.
One more question on efficacies before we move to values towards the end of the show. In the disinformation world, in the world of mass modern media as you see it, what is the difference between the truth and the narrative, and which is more important to get a grasp on?
It's like the signal and the noise kind of challenge, isn't it? There's a well-known book with that title. I think it helps to be sort of specific, of course, if we're talking about individual narratives. But in all instances, it helps to have some grounding in history and the ability to question that history and understand, the multiple points of view that even an individual topic might engender in a point of history, because then you can start to see the intentionally manufactured narratives. You can see the unintentionally manufactured narratives, the manipulations and distortions based on maybe the period someone's living in or their political background. But I think without a sort of grounding in the complex debate around certain historical topics, then it starts to become very difficult to pick out those narratives. So it's not an easy answer. I mean, it basically suggests that people need to become experts at the things they talk about before they just, spew out some kind of phrase. And that case in point that we came to earlier, someone talking about great Russian culture and the topic of how imperial entities tend to restrict or crush or suppress, let's say, ethnic identities and literatures. I mean, I think those two topics are fascinating, but you can't just pronounce on those and make some kind of broad announcement on that without saying or having an understanding that Russian literature exists because the territory has been cleared of rivals and huge resources have been put behind the amplification of one culture, and the others haven't just been suppressed. They've been literally, like the slash and burn technique, the ground has been cleared to make sure there's no competition. It's impossible to talk about great Russian culture, I think, without talking about imperialism. And yet many people who are extremely highly educated will see or will claim that literature and politics don't mix, and that Russian literature especially, should be seen as distinct from politics, when Russian literature is the most political literature of any country in history, simply because it's one, it's been weaponized by the imperial entity, and two, because it's so much formed in reaction to imperialism and the setting that it was created in. And that it's weaponized to this day and used to perpetuate that same desire to expand, conquer, and destroy.
Onto you, your motivations, your values. When I say the words freedom and democracy, what images do those conjure in your mind? What do the concepts mean, and what is their value? You've dedicated your life now to combating the disinformation of an empire in defense of what?
Almost come to the end of my voice for today. I mean, it started through curiosity of how does democratic culture, how do newspapers and satire and all the things that we see in, let's say those satirical paintings of Hogarth and others in the 18th century, how does that all come about, and how does that turn into the present? And it starts with a level of curiosity in terms of history and the mechanics of that, and also an interest in why Russia is so different from that. So I think there's a dual purpose. Through understanding Russia, I get to understand that history a bit more, but I also get to understand, the processes that have given rise to our own pluralistic, democratic culture and institutions better, by comparing it to a society that hasn't undergone the dramatic processes of Renaissance, Enlightenment, and all of these, revolution after revolution. So it starts as a process of discovering interest. I studied politics at A-level and history and so on, and then moved on to university to study literature, history, and then Russian. But so there's always been a curiosity. But at some point, and this is especially, from the early 2000s, no, in fact, from the late 90s, when I was in Russia and decided I didn't want to stay there, it was already apparent to me that the slide back towards a more authoritarian style had begun way back in 97, before most people had an inkling of that. And it's, the first Chechen war and some of the things that I saw happening, the way people were press ganged into the army, and the stories of the treatment within the army and what people would do to prevent their children from being called up. It seemed to me that we were sliding back into a darker phase of history. Now, no inkling at that point of how dark it could get. But when Putin came in the early 2000s, I think that realization started to dawn. And then really, it's almost an act of self-preservation, because what turns out to be a curiosity, by 2016, this directly affects us. The cynicism, as well as the sort of nativism, which I think Russia has certainly done a part to help promote. And I won't say, Russia equals Brexit, etc., but it was strategically in their interest. There's no question there. They very much rejoiced when that happened. And I'm convinced that through all sorts of means, they were trying to promote it and promote individuals that are a heart of that movement. Now, it's impossible to say empirically whether their efforts drove it over the line. And we also have to take responsibility for what we did as a country in Brexit, and the lies that were told and the lies that went unchallenged, and the fact that we couldn't find a strong narrative on the Remain side, and all those kind of things. But it became apparent to me, at least in 2016, that we were directly under attack. And the fact that we were under attack at that point meant that almost certainly the ground for that attack had been laid several years previously, if not decades previously, probably building on the sort of Soviet active measures. So at that point, what was an interest turned into something that felt quite existential already. It's directly affecting me, my children, and my wealth and my community. And it's destroying the cohesive sense of the country. I mean, people may not remember too much, but 2012 felt like a sort of high point of the return of Britain. We were strong and we were confident, and we're united as a nation. And just a few short years later, that unity is shattered. In some ways, Ukraine has helped to sort of repair some of that, and it's brought a lot of people from both sides of that debate back, and it's reminded us that we have a lot more in common than that which divides us, which is good. But I see an export of Russian nihilism and divisiveness, and I see that spreading around the world, and it directly affects me. So that's politics found me, and I can't pretend it's not there. It's not malicious.
This is something I often tell people who are not necessarily politically interested. It's that, well, you might not be interested in politics, but politics is always interested in you.
Yes.
Just back to the question though, the value of freedom and democracy in your eyes.
I think, yes, it gives rise to all sorts of nice things. It allows us to solve problems in a way that might not seem very efficient in the moment, but over the longer term, freedom turns out to be a much more efficient way, a much less wasteful way at solving our problems. And I think that's the important thing. It's far from perfect and it's far from efficient, but all the other methods that we've tried before have been far less efficient at creating innovation and creating solutions to our various issues. And that's one of the fundamentals. I also think one of the key mechanics, and this isn't my idea, obviously, this has been around for a long time. I think Karl Popper was the leading advocate for it. And this really blew my mind. The democracy isn't about who you elect or who you bring in, because ultimately they come and go and turn out to be fallible like everybody else, and their solutions are tested and may not work. The key to democracy is being able to remove people from power when their time comes and when they lose. I would say the sort of franchise of the electorate, when they lose the support. So the key mechanism is problem solving and removal of people from power. And those two things go hand in hand. What Russian history has taught me is that when you cannot remove people from power, you dramatically lose your ability to solve problems. And if you do have a sort of enlightened dictator or enlightened tyrant, and you are able to solve some problems, then often the solutions you come up with are not sustainable because they were championed by an authoritarian figure. They can be eradicated by whoever comes next, and Russian history is replete with these cases. You think a problem is partially solved, you're on the way to solving it, and then you have a change of authoritarian, and boom, it's all gone. It doesn't have the capacity of inheritability of solutions. I think those are the key features to democracy. I mean, we're not perfect. We don't have a perfect memory. But the memory, the institutional memory, is slightly better than it is under authoritarian rulers. And the accumulation of slightly better amounts to very much better in the long term.
And my final question, do you have anything to say or any message to send to the authoritarians, the autocrats, the dictators, and the oligarchs of the world?
Yes, you'll be dead too one day, and your works will be forgotten and derided. You won't command the respect and the fear that you do at the moment. These things are transitory, but the damage you cause in establishing that fear and authority, that will outlast you. And if that's what they want their legacy to be, then so be it. But we will oppose them with everything that we've got, and we will not succumb to them in the way that, Ukrainians also refusing to succumb.
Putin is Ozymandias with ballistic missiles.
Yes. Dark Ages, tyrant, or as I said in one of my early interviews, I think with Mr. Galeotti, isn't it true that the Russian political system has less sophistication than a Viking raiding party? No one's come up with a compelling argument against that so far.
Well, it's certainly how they act. Although I think that's being rather cruel to the Vikings.
They had more political sophistication, I think, actually.
Yes, I think so. John, thank you very much for coming on. Where can my listeners find your work if they want to find it?
So YouTube, Silicon Curtain, should be easy to find, but we're also on podcast, all the popular podcast platforms as well. Silicon Curtain, called Silicon Curtain because it's like Iron Curtain, but the Russian bullshit is now everywhere. You can't escape it. It's in every device with a silicon chip, and that's where the name comes from. But also the fight against propaganda, also contained in every device with a silicon chip. So that's the channel. Look it up, subscribe. We have videos every day, long form interviews, and also deep dives on news stories that are unfolding with a bit of analysis and hopefully a bit of insight that I get from being able to listen to Russian language sources as well, which I do sort of 3 or 4 hours a day.
John, wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. A real pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Why We Fight. What struck you most about their story? What did you agree or disagree with? Drop a comment and let us know. And if this conversation meant something to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who cares about democracy as much as you do. To get early access and support independent journalism, join us on Patreon or Substack. Links are in the description. And if you want to connect with a global community of people who care about freedom and human rights, come hang out with us on Discord. Until next time, remember, democracy is non-negotiable.